Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. My name is Rabbi Kahn.
I'm Talli Rosenbaum. Today we have what I think is going to be an important episode. We originally were going to continue our series about sexuality throughout the life cycle in married couples, beginning with what we had begun talking about, infertility and then pregnancy and then postpartum. So our next natural episode was going to be on how married couples navigate sexuality and intimacy in midlife from their 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. I think what we decided to do before we do that, we want to really target a demographic that gets left out a lot in the conversation about intimacy and sexuality, and that is people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s who are dating because they're alone and they would like to be able to form a relationship. But it is complicated. It's complicated whether it's because of past experiences due to divorce, loss of being a widow, and what it means again to start again in an intimate relationship. And also we want to acknowledge and talk about the experience of people who have never been married and have never been in that kind of relationship and are still trying to do that in midlife and what that can be like. I think it's really important that we have this discussion for this demographic, so we don't leave people out of the discussion about intimacy.
Absolutely. We'll get to that in just a moment. First, remember to check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, etc. Rate and review. Please leave a comment as well. Tell people about Intimate Judaism and share the podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. Our past 2 months have been our 2 biggest months of all time, so we thank you very much for helping us out. Please join the Intimate Judaism team on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus material, episodes, merch, and more. You can find the link in the description of the podcast and in the show notes. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. Talli, I'd like to begin today's episode by mentioning something that happened on the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group on Facebook. You would put up a post there asking for people to send in their questions and comments about today's episode in preparation for this episode. And there were some people on that group and outside of that group who argued effectively, and I know I'm oversimplifying, but effectively said, what's the point of even discussing this? What is worth discussing in this particular topic? Because either, if we're going to be discussing sexuality at midlife and later among singles, either the people are breaking halacha, or they're not, in which case they're sexually frustrated, and that's it. And that's basically the binary that was set up. Again, I know I'm oversimplifying. I'm sure the people who spoke to me about that, both publicly and privately, were completely genuine and meant this only with the best of intentions, even as I disagree with them. And I wanted to ask you to perhaps explain why you and I think that that is not correct and why this topic does need to be addressed, despite that argument that it really is pointless.
Well, I don't think it's pointless to discuss sexuality and intimacy, even if it may be against the halacha to engage in it. That's 2 separate things. So I don't think it's pointless at all. I also don't want to reduce the experience of people, real human beings who have been through a lot in their lives. And sexuality is part of who they are. I don't want to reduce it to whether they transgress or don't transgress. I don't think it's about that. I think that decision to engage is governed by many, many different factors. And one of them is certainly going to be halachic, but there are many, many other factors that we need to think about whether or not the decision is made to engage, how to engage, how to talk about things like consent. What are the ethics around it? What are the concerns around it? Reducing people to just whether or not they're sinning because they're having sex when they shouldn't be, or even just not being shomer negia, maybe not having sex. But I don't think that's the issue. I think that there's really a lot to talk about here. And also, if that's the kind of attitude, then I also think that we have a lot to do in terms of helping people to understand the complexity, to be empathic and understanding of what it must be like to be alone and to have suffered loss. I mean, there's a lot of loss involved here. There's loss involved certainly for people who have lost their spouses to death. There's certainly loss if the person that they lost was sick for a long time. That kind of loss of the ability to connect sexually will have already begun much earlier into the process. For couples who lost a spouse suddenly without any warning, there's a sudden cutoff from having a spouse, having a partner, having a best friend, and having a lover all at once. So there's a huge amount of loss that needs to be processed and dealt with. There's also loss for single people who did not merit to find a partner. There's a lot of kind of ongoing loneliness and ongoing frustration with relationships that don't work out. So I think that recognizing that there's a lot of loss here, and there's a loss also of your sexuality as a human being. What does it mean to your sexuality when you don't have a partner to express it with? And to what extent, when you navigate the idea of committing to somebody new, since that sexual piece is so much a part of you now and had been so much a part of your previous relationships, how do you go into a second marriage without that piece? How do you even go into the creation of an intimate relationship, when you're dating in this age group? It's going to feel very, very different to be shomer negia, let's say, at 19, 20, 21, 22. Not that it's easy then either, but it's different when physical intimacy has been a part of how you express love, because that's what you did with your previous partner. It's going to feel very different and awkward. And there's like so many different types of scenarios that I can bring just based on the kind of situations that come into my clinic.
And I think that there is a strain within Judaism that effectively looks at Judaism. I'm using that term advisedly. Judaism and halakha, Jewish law, are one and the same. Like, what is halakha is Judaism. What is Judaism is halakha. And nothing outside of that realm is Jewish, if I can use that term. And I do acknowledge that such a strain does exist within Judaism, but I think that it's wrongheaded for us to pretend there aren't other ways of looking at it that understand Judaism as something which is bigger than just halakha. That includes halakha and. Not that I'm saying that halakha is not normative. I'm not trying to say that, there are many ways of being Jewish, you don't have to keep halakha. That is not what I'm saying. But to reduce Judaism and reducing our entire way of looking at the world to, does it fit within a halachic framework or not? And that's all there is to discuss, I think is certainly a gross oversimplification of many strands of thought within Judaism, and even within those that see halakha as the primary or the only aspect of what Judaism is about. It's also reductionist to say there's nothing to talk about, emotions don't matter. Someone mentioned the term halachic maximalism, looking at that as effectively defining what we are as Torah Jews. I think in this particular context is not fair. I think there has to be a lot more that we have to see, even if we are halachically committed, absolutely, which I hope that I am. At the same time, to reduce everything just to whether it's allowed or not, and that's all that Torah cares about, I think, is reducing Torah more than Torah deserves to be reduced. Talli, I want to actually mention and quote somebody who wrote to me in response to your post. I want to mention that this woman is a divorcee. She's religious. And I just want to quote a few lines of what she wrote, because I think at least the conflict, this issue that comes up for many people, older singles, can be seen in some of what she mentions. Let me read some of her words. I don't want to be married necessarily. Second marriage and kids is so hard to balance. But I want companionship. And I've chosen a certain lifestyle that doesn't encourage casual dating or not being shomer negia. So now I'm forced to be alone and isolated, or compromise halakha and be physical, or settle for marriage when I know it will be too hard. How does one discuss their preference for bedroom life while still appearing modest and sanua? Also, many parents live in communities that are family-based and not social life-based, so I sit home alone, lonely on Shabbat. The person I went out with tonight, he's frum. We discussed after a few days of chatting that he is kinky, and he said that he is hooked up with many frum women who are kinky, and I believe it. I think a lot more goes on than people talk about, and it's a shame the community does not accept that older singles will date and be physical. So we have to hide it, and then that's not emotionally healthy. But finding this part of myself was very healthy for me. I'm happy to open up anonymously for others to know about this. She continues, my boyfriend lived with me for half a year, and many of my friends knew, and it was what it was, yet my children go to Haredi schools. Is it ideal? No. Did people judge? I don't know. Did anyone say anything to me? No, because I only told people whom I trust. But as a frum Jew, how could I in good conscience do something that's not allowed and against what's binding? I don't eat lobster. Why is this different? Does God want us to rush into things, create mental health stress for us and our children, just to obtain a natural human desire of physicality and intimacy and connectedness? I'm not asking you per se. I'm saying it's a lose-lose no matter what. I just want to do God's will and be happy. And physical connection brings me happiness. People say go hiking with a female friend, but it's not the same. We crave connection, closeness, trust, vulnerability. I'm not even reading everything that she wrote, but I think in some ways, Talli, it's like a cri de coeur. You see, she goes back and forth while describing her emotions. She says, I need connection. Of course I'm physical and people shouldn't judge, but I'm violating God's will and that really bothers me. And this dynamic tension going on in her mind, her emotions, is very touching, I thought. The way that she really doesn't know what to do, even though she's made a decision. She's made a decision that she's not Shomer Negia. At the same time, she doesn't pretend that, oh, I'm doing exactly what halacha demands. She knows that she's not. But she says, I don't really know what else I'm supposed to do. And I wanted to sort of throw that out there just as a way, as a means to open up our conversation today. Maybe you can comment on this because, again, I know we're not really just discussing halacha. Halacha is pretty clear about the impermissibility of touching outside of marriage. There's not much to talk about when we're speaking about some sort of derech chiba. We're talking about intimate touch, whether it's hugging and kissing. I don't really see halacha allowing that. I don't want to pretend otherwise. But to pretend there's nothing else to talk about is wrongheaded. Anyway, I'll pass it over to you now, Talli.
Wow, there's so much to process in this letter that you just read to me. And I think it's rich. It's rich with such an authentic description of, somebody's vulnerability and somebody's real experience. And it's such an opportunity. This would be a wonderful kind of case to bring before a room full of rabbis who are hopefully learning a little bit about what it means to be a pastoral counselor as a rabbi, because all too often we get that same very binary black and white, halacha is halacha, like as if somebody's bringing you a chicken, kosher or not kosher. And here, what we're dealing with is that there's a lot of complexity to people, and there's a lot of complexity to the situation. And there is often a need to really appreciate that we can integrate different parts of ourselves and live our best lives in terms of living our lives with integrity.
I agree 100%. I'm just anticipating some people saying, and by the way, probably there was a time when I would have said this myself, so I want to ask you to confirm. People probably say, okay, well, that's unfortunate, but she is the exception to the very large rule where most frum people are not doing that when they're single and they're older. And from what I've seen, from what she says, and I'm going to assume, I want to ask to confirm with you, from what you've seen in your practice, that is not true. While there certainly are people who are older singles, who are later singles, who are Shomer Negia, there are plenty in the frum world, and I don't just mean the left-wing Orthodox world, I mean across the Orthodox spectrum, there are plenty who do touch and who are engaged in intimate touch and in sexuality, even when they're not married. I won't pretend to know what the percentages are, but I'm pretty sure it's not a vanishing minority the way sometimes people assume. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and this is why I think that we need to move away from the question of whether, because that's a decision that each person needs to kind of make with their own process of what feels right and how, they can live with integrity with their decisions, but also how. It's not just about, okay, I'm going to have sex or not going to have sex, or I'm going to be shomer or not be shomer. There's a whole world of how to navigate. Your friend who wrote you the letter spoke about, hooking up and kink and all sorts of things that happen with divorced religious people. That's kind of one way of navigating sex. And then there's also the idea of companionship and the idea of sex in the context of a serious, committed relationship or the building of a committed relationship. Those may not be so different in terms of the halachic legitimacy or not of those things, but they're certainly very different in terms of Jewish ethics and values. We can certainly decide that if we are going to, like how you put break halacha, we can still do it in the context of acting within our best selves Jewishly. But I think what's most important about what you bring is that I'm hoping that it really does allow people who are listening to this podcast to be able to look at people in a different way, with empathy, with understanding, the kind of conflicts that are so difficult, being single, not having a companion, not being allowed halachically to express yourself in a sexual way. This is the same for LGBTQ people in a way. Like, we have to be able to broaden our ability to be more compassionate, to be more understanding, and to stop judging, because it's nobody's goddamn business what people are doing sexually. It's like people get so, I don't know, like they get so triggered, they get so reactive, and I'm sure that they have their own histories that create that. But what I want to do here is to be able to say, look, it is happening. And if it is happening, let's be able to talk about what we need to talk about in navigating these relationships. So first of all, the letter talked about not wanting to get married. I think that we have to recognize that often women, if there was an aguna situation, if there was an abuse situation, if there were marital dynamics that felt oppressive, a woman may not want to enter into a kiddushin situation again. She may want to have a committed relationship, but may be afraid of the whole institution of marriage. So that's a situation.
And this letter writer seems to be in that category.
Yeah, it could very well be. I don't know how old this woman is. She might still develop and change and decide otherwise. But for her, I think that the most important question is, look, I don't eat lobster. I don't do other things. I send my kids to Haredi schools. How do I be with myself around this? I think that this is an amazing question. It's an amazing question that comes to rabbis, and it's an amazing question that comes to therapists. From a therapeutic and also pastoral rabbinic point of view, it's really about being with that person in her dilemma, in her conflict, without judgment, really understanding that choosing this does not make her a bad person. But, the way you're going to choose it, does that mean you're going to go hook up every night, not think about STDs, not think about consent boundaries? Like, no, these are important things to talk about. Maybe even mikvah is an important thing to talk about, because we don't have to throw the whole thing out. We can still act within the framework of our Jewish values. And I think that that's an important message.
I think it's also important to say that when we talk about not being judgmental, that does not mean that we have to assume everyone's values are equally good and they can do whatever they want and I can do whatever I want and I don't care what I do, or nothing is binding. There's a very big gap between basically moral nihilism and saying do whatever you want versus I'm not going to judge anybody even though I maintain my own values and know what I would want to do, I hope, if I were in that situation, though I can't judge you. Meaning I know what I can do, I know what I believe is right, and I can accept somebody even if I don't necessarily think that those choices are choices that I would choose myself. I just don't want it to be that non-judgmentalism means that everything everyone does is great and I can necessarily approve of. No one's asking me for my approval, so therefore I'm not going to give it or withdraw it. But there's a very big difference between approval per se, at least in theory, and acceptance and understanding that I'm not in that person's shoes. I can have empathy for a person saying, I don't know what it's like. That's not my situation. Or even if I think it's similar to my situation, no one's situation is identical, and therefore there's no room to judge. Only God can judge. But at the same time, I don't want that to turn into, Scott Kahn just said halacha isn't binding. That's not what I mean. I think that halacha is normative for Jews, and I hope that Jews do keep halacha. At the same time, I don't know what God thinks. That's not for me to decide. I'd like to also mention something else, Talli. Somebody named Mark Fine reached out to me on Facebook. I'd not met him before, but he reposted your post, and he made some very good points and really helped me think through this issue. He pointed out that he really appreciated that you wrote a difference between sexuality and intimacy in your post. You mentioned sexuality and intimacy, and that relates to what you just mentioned. I asked him, why is that important to you? What does that mean? He said that these things are really two different categories because even though we confuse them and treat them as the same thing, there's a very big difference emotionally. There's a very big difference in terms of the way we relate to ourselves and to others. If a person simply is, to put it bluntly, hungry for sex versus somebody who is craving a type of connection expressed through touch or perhaps even expressed through sex. He said these are not the same thing. And when I asked him to elaborate, playing a bit of devil's advocate, I said, well, from a halachic perspective, frankly, halacha doesn't really care. Halacha doesn't care if you're hugging somebody because you crave emotional connection or because it's the prelude to sex. It remains forbidden. So again, I asked him, why does it really matter from a halachic perspective? And he mentioned two very important points. He said, first of all, and this relates to what you just said, Talli, we have to move away from that binary attitude of either you're a halachic Jew or you're not. He said halacha probably should be seen less as a light switch and more like a dimmer. And yes, there are people who turn everything on, and there are some people who turn it off completely. And then there's a dimmer switch where some people keep some things and not other things, or try their best or don't try their best and are keeping certain things. And this goes back to the question about, I don't eat lobster, but I do this. How can I understand myself? Well, if we look at Judaism only as a binary, you either do it or you don't, then we're disenfranchising a lot of people. And we can say, well, there's a dimmer switch. And again, as a halachic Jew, my feeling is that people should strive to keep more and more. But just because somebody isn't keeping something right now doesn't mean that we have to say, therefore, you're out of the club, and therefore you may as well just chuck it all out and throw out the baby with the bathwater. There is a lot of room in the middle. And when we describe someone as either halachic or not halachic, we may be doing a disservice to both them and the community at large.
Yeah, let's treat it with compassion. Let's understand that, society changes. And as society changes, if we stick to just looking at dry halacha, we will end up not appreciating the Jewish value of inclusion and compassion and the big picture. Where's the big picture going to go?
And Talli, that gets back also to what you mentioned before about rabbis or halachic authorities or whatever needing to look at it not only from a halachic perspective, but also from a pastoral perspective. And that relates also to what Mark said to me as well. He said, if we look at people as halachic constructs, then you're right. There's nothing to talk about except is it mutar or is it asur? But the conversations are very different if someone comes to a rabbi and says that, as I mentioned before, I'm going crazy, I need to sleep with somebody, versus I miss an emotional connection with somebody. Forget the halacha for a second. As a matter of pastoral counseling, as a matter of empathizing, understanding where they're coming from, there's an extraordinarily different approach in both cases, even if halacha technically isn't differentiating between them. And too often, too many people ignore the pastoral approach and don't necessarily hear that question as well.
Yeah. By the way, just to push the button even a little further, is if somebody comes and says, look, I'm going crazy, I need to sleep with someone, there's empathy there to be had for that person as well.
Oh, for sure.
Really, really hard.
I'm not saying that person doesn't deserve empathy. I'm just saying it's a different question. The person is discussing it's basically a different issue. I hope we can empathize with everybody, but it's a different question in terms of what the person's actually asking, what is really being said over there. It's interesting because Mark said to me another point which kind of relates to this, and I'll get back to you, Talli, because he said, look, the bottom line, when someone goes and says those things to the rabbi, I crave this emotional connection, or I crave sex, whatever, the person knows the answer already. The person isn't saying, does halacha allow me to have sex with somebody because I really, really need it? Chances are that person knows the answer, so we have to hear what really is being asked when that person goes to the rabbi and mentions that. That's really a pastoral question by definition, because unless the person is truly unfamiliar with the most basic ideas of halachic attitude towards sex, the person probably knows that outside of marriage, sex is not allowed and touching is not allowed. So it's generally a matter of listening to the question as much as it is giving an answer.
So thanks for that. I want to kind of move past whether it's allowed or not allowed,
right,
and kind of talk about what are the real issues that come up for divorcees and for widows and widowers. I'll start a little bit with that. So I think one thing that comes up a lot is, I don't want to reenact. I was in a marriage. There was the dynamic of the marriage, the communication in the marriage, the experiences in that marriage. I want something, a tikkun. I want something different, better. Maybe my partner had a certain orientation. Maybe that my partner was gay. Maybe my partner was into kink and I wasn't. Or maybe I'm into kink and I want to find someone who is. Or maybe he had a sexual dysfunction that I don't want to encounter again. How am I going to know? Or a woman who's been divorced or widowed for a long time, maybe 10 years or more, has not been sexually active and wants to be sexually active again because maybe she is shomer negiah, has always been shomer negiah, and dates shomer and wants to get married again, finds a lovely older man, but she's afraid she's not going to be able to function after all this time. Maybe it's going to be painful. These are issues that come up on a regular basis. And I'm talking about people who come in and say, what do I do? Because I want to know that we're sexually compatible. We're not two 20-year-olds who are going to figure it out together because we each don't have any past experiences. We're both people with our histories. How do we figure these things out? I also think that there's this issue of vulnerability around having sex with a new person when you've only had one sexual partner your whole life. The idea of taking your clothes off for somebody, if he's not your husband, he hasn't grown with you, and also for a man, it's not your wife who's known you all those years. It can feel very scary. Your body has changed. You don't know how you're going to function. It's very vulnerable, the sexual place. And these are very important to acknowledge, to be able to communicate about, to be able to talk about. I cannot stress enough how important it is for couples to be able to voice and talk about their concerns with one another, because whether or not you choose to actually engage physically, the ability to talk about it is of paramount importance. There's one other thing I did also want to bring up in this context, that, there is no consistent experience of people after divorce or after widowhood or late singles regarding sex. Yes, it's true what you said, that there is definitely this kind of very active understanding that divorced people get together, but it runs a spectrum. Like somebody said to me, a friend who is now married, but he was divorced for a long time. People think that they're hopping into each other's beds, There's also that. And there's also people who are very, very, very exclusive about who they might choose to engage with physically. And the reason why that's so important to talk about is that a lot of people, when they're newly divorced or been divorced for a while or even widowed, they don't know how to navigate the whole dating thing when it comes to sex. So very often, especially like on these apps, these dating apps, there's a question from the get-go: are you shomer? Are you shomer is sometimes like code for, are you down to hook up? Mm-hmm. And I've heard this from women, and
it's not really about shomer per se. It's
not. It's about, I'm not really looking to date for marriage, or I'm not really looking to form an intimate relationship, or maybe I am also looking for those things, but I'm looking to date for sex. And that's something that you need to know how to navigate. If you've been married for 30 years and you suddenly find yourself single for whatever reason, you have to know how to be able to, I had somebody say to me, like, this guy started to hold my hand and I didn't know that I wanted to hold his hand. And I said, well, what would it have been for you if he would have said, can I hold your hand? Would it be okay to hold your hand? She said, that would have been great. Then I would have thought about it. You're not bad for wanting to touch, okay? But you can't just assume that you can touch somebody. You have to negotiate it. You have to ask first, because people who've been married for 30 years, they're dealing with new people and they don't know how, and they don't always know. She was like, I don't want to hurt his feelings. I didn't know what to say. I just shut down. Like, people need to be prepared to navigate this whole playing field.
How do people learn how to navigate that? You said they have to be prepared to do so, but no one trains you to be an older single. No one trains you to be a divorcee now navigating new relationships. So where does a person learn that? Especially, I would assume, if people who've been previously married and now widowed or divorced, they bring with them all sorts of assumptions about how the other gender acts based on their previous assumption. Exactly. They're walking in with all sorts of assumptions which may not be accurate except in their own prior relationship. So how does a person get from A to B?
This is exactly why we have to normalize discussion around sexuality in this demographic, because if we don't, then you're stuck. You're stuck with not having any education about it, not having any preparation for it, not having anybody to talk to about it. And that's why we're doing this podcast, because you can talk about these things. And, you are entitled to give consent or not give consent, not just because of halakha. If you just say, well, I'm shomer, you can also be entitled to not be shomer and still say, no, this is not matimli. Like, I don't feel like doing this with you.
Right. I wanted to ask about, discussing it out loud. I wonder if for some people, And I don't know if this is more prevalent in more right-wing communities, but maybe it's prevalent across the Orthodox spectrum. Maybe somebody is afraid that even discussing it will scare the other person away. Because let's say, for example, one person wants to talk about whether it's worth for them to be shomer negiah in their own religious and physical life. And the other person might be, well, if that's even an issue for you, then I'm out of here, because I'm simply not in that place where I would ever even dream of going out with somebody who would think of touching outside the context of marriage. So it's one thing to say, Talli, that we have to normalize conversations, but conversations are also vulnerable and dangerous, because you can kick somebody out effectively, or that person could kick you up, because it's not that you said that I'm touching you. It's the fact that you're willing to even consider it might say we are clearly in different worlds right now. How does that work?
And you clearly are. If somebody's going to say, well, look, I am so...
Well, not necessarily. You could have somebody who perceives of himself or herself as Haredi, for example, like the letter writer who said her children go to Haredi schools. At the same time, just because you portray as Haredi and you see yourself as Haredi, that doesn't mean that every Haredi sees it as all on or all off. That person can also see things as a dimmer. So you might not be in different worlds, really. One person might perceive it like that.
But you're not in the, when I say you might not be compatible, it's not because you're not in different worlds, but because you have a different values or different way of looking at it. I think what's more common, and I think that this is an unfortunate situation, is that there is physical activity or sexual activity that takes place without any discussion about it, as though it's kind of split into, like, we're not really doing this kind of thing. And I think we've talked about this before, by the way, and I would also remind listeners that we have an earlier episode from a couple seasons ago about late singles. We're talking more then, I think, about people in their late 20s, 30s, and that was more, I think, that demographic. Today, we're really talking more about mamash midlife. But even so, I think you'll have people, even at midlife, although it's less common, because I think at midlife, people are generally more integrated in terms of who they are, and they don't really suffer too much with split off parts because you're more mature and you're more developed. But for many people still, this idea that they're doing something that's not halachic, they can't really wrap their heads around that they're choosing it. And so they do it as this kind of thing that's happening to them, and there's no real discussion about it. And that's dangerous. It's dangerous because you're not exactly taking accountability for what you're doing. You're doing it as this kind of, like, we talked about it before, nafalnu, we failed. Yeah, which is, I would say, a legitimate experience as well. There are people that will say, look, it was too hard and we broke shomer, and let's try harder not to. Again, I'm not judging any of these experiences, but the experience of that didn't really happen. We didn't really do that, or we're not really hooking up, or we're not really, that's kind of dangerous, because that's being done in a split off way from the rest of who you are.
Can you explain why that's dangerous? I might argue that's very healthy. I'm allowing myself to maintain my sense of identity, my sense of self, my sense of integrity, and I'm not defining myself based on what I did.
It might not be dangerous in this age group that you might get pregnant because you're not using your frontal lobe enough to think about birth control, but it might be dangerous if you aren't thinking about things like STDs, using a condom. People in this age group need to think about things like that if they're going to be sexually active with more than one person. It could be dangerous if that person that you're having sex with is married. There's a lot of reasons why kind of splitting into a behavior without taking along your judgment can be dangerous. I always say this. I think we're accountable. We're responsible. We choose our behaviors. We have to be able to say, this is what I'm choosing to do, or to be able to say, I'm choosing not to do it.
Can you talk a little bit about how dating in later life, midlife or later, how it's fundamentally different to doing it earlier? In other words, I know we talked about it a little bit, but the fact that you're bringing your experiences with you, what problems often arise, sexually or otherwise, in the dating process that come along with people often who are older singles, widowed, or divorced? How does that affect the
there's
dating?
so much, and there's like no universal answer for this. It's so different for everybody. And the differences have to do with your own personality, your own skills at intimacy and attachment, your own past experiences. It's different if you're widowed or if you're divorced. A lot of people who are widowed First of all, not everybody who was widowed had a great marriage, but a lot of people did. And for those people, they really want to marry somebody very often who understands what they've been through, where they could talk about their partner freely and they're totally fine with the other person because they're part of that relationship. Yes, that might be a situation of there being 4 people in the bed. That can happen. That person's always there with you. There's so many issues around being vulnerable, being authentic. Was the relationship that you had for so many years of your life a safe one? Was it one that you had real connection and friendship? And are you trying to reestablish that? Or can you wrap your head around the fact that it's not going to be the same? It's going to be different. The expectations might be different. There's no idealization of what you had or what you, if you're single and never married, what you might have always wanted to have. Because a lot of times later in life, we marry for companionship. We don't want to be alone, but it's not a perfect situation. So that's one issue. Now, as far as sexual issues, I think that there's just too much fear about sexual functioning. People are afraid that they're, going to get married and they're not going to be able to have an erection, or their erection's not going to be sustainable, or there's going to be pain with intercourse. This is especially common, I would say, amongst people who will come for sex therapy who are not sexually active because of their being very religious, and having sex before marriage would not be an option. And I do want to shout out to that demographic because they are there, and we want to be able to provide assistance, certainly therapeutically, for people who are not going to check out their sexual compatibility before marriage. In this book, I Am for My Beloved, that I wrote with David Ribner, we have a case study in here about a couple getting married in their 60s who did not have sex before marriage. The guy has some erectile issues and she has some pain with intercourse issues. This is very common. This comes up. And just to kind of give the headline of that kind of counseling, what we usually want to tell people is to learn to really appreciate pleasure, that sex should not be performative, that the relationship does not need to be based on whether or not the function works. Although I have to say, for many people, especially people who have been in marriages where there was sexual dysfunction, they definitely and completely legitimately would be very afraid to have that same thing happen again, which is why communication about this is so important. But back to my point about valuing pleasure and not performance. And this is true, by the way, when we do our episode on married couples who get into their later years and there are some issues with functioning. There might be some vaginal dryness. There might be some erectile dysfunction. There might not be that same kind of flow that was in the past. So we'll talk about that. But what I'm going to say is the same thing that I'm going to say in terms of, it's not all about function. And I look forward to that episode because I hope to also bring some data from studies about why older people continue to value sex past their reproductive years, why sex is so important, why it is such an important part of who we are. And again, coming back to this demographic, because there's no legitimate way to talk about it, we often ignore the person who's the sexual human being, even though they haven't been in a married relationship. They're still sexual human beings, and not being able to talk about it or saying, what's there to talk about? Either you're this transgressive person that's transgressing halakha, or you're just like a misken who can't do anything for you. What's there to talk about? And I think that that's a very reductionist and, not to mention, not particularly empathic approach.
I want to ask you 2 questions now about older singles who do get married. Here's my first question. Is it common for there to be a lot of guilt when a person who is, let's say, widowed marries somebody new? Is it a problem often that the person feels that they're betraying their first partner? For the sake of argument, it was a wonderful marriage and the person unfortunately passed away. Now that person seeks companionship. Do they feel that they are actually betraying their original partner by getting married again, and sexually or otherwise?
Sometimes, and sometimes really the therapeutic work really is about, being able to kind of heal that sense of guilt. I think that for many individuals who were married to partners who were sick and had a process, often that was discussed. Often the partner had an opportunity to say, look, I want you to continue to live I want you to get married again. I want you to be able to, oh, I'm getting emotional. Because I just know people. It's a gift to give to your partner, to give them that permission.
Mm-hmm. What about a situation where someone who's been widowed is now together with someone who was divorced? Those are very, very different experiences. They both experienced loss, but one had what we can say was, at least at the end of their marriage, a failed marriage. That's why they got divorced, presumably. And the other one, maybe it was a failed marriage also, but as far as we know, it was a loving marriage that ended tragically in a different kind of way. Does that often cause a certain kind of tension because their memories of what they had are so vastly and importantly different?
Well, I think whatever permutation you end up with, whether they're both divorced or one was divorced and one was widowed, or one was single and one was, whatever permutation you come up with, you're going to have issues. And, I don't think that you can say like, oh, this is a great match, or this is going to have these issues, or this is going to have, I know people who have really have wonderful second marriages, even though they were widowed and maybe one partner was divorced, and it's different. I think the idea is that it's not the same marriage. It's a different marriage. Even like married people at midlife sometimes marry each other again, so to speak. Like they have a different marriage because the first marriage was so problematic, but they didn't divorce. They went through couples therapy and they changed their marriage, and it's a different marriage. And, you sometimes have to kind of give up on those expectations and accept what your marriage is and make the best out of it. So it's not about better or worse, but it's really about what this marriage is about, how we are in this marriage, what's our contract, what's our levels of kind of doing things differently. My children, we didn't even get into that whole thing, which is so complicated about blended families. And my children and your children in their 20s and 30s, accepting or not accepting, or encouraging or not encouraging, having grandchildren together, weddings, who walks down. We were focusing on intimacy and the sexuality, but we could do a whole other podcast on who pays. Yeah. Remembering all sometimes there's a lot of grandchildren between the two of you when you get to be two people in their 50s or 60s. So there's really so much to work out. Also, do you live together all the time? Or do you maybe, keep separate homes? Sometimes there are couples who still very much value their privacy or their alone time. There's really so much to talk about. I mean, to think that there isn't, because either you're doing something not allowed, or I don't know, that doesn't seem to resonate with me.
I think we covered a lot of the basic ideas. What we're doing here today is obviously not an extensive and comprehensive discussion. We're opening up a conversation. I'll just say one thing as my own conclusion, which is that yesterday I was interviewing for my other podcast, Orthodox Conundrum, Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig. This was not our topic, but in that context, we were actually talking about LGBTQ issues. In the context of that discussion, he actually cited a Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, in section 3, chapter 34. And this gets back to what we mentioned at the beginning. This Rambam effectively says that sometimes the Torah will treat people not fairly. Meaning, the Torah was designed for Klal Yisrael. It was designed for the people as a whole. And sometimes, unfortunately, individuals get left aside in ways which are not really fair to them. And I'll even just read it over here. It says, "The law was not given with a view to things that are rare. For in everything that it wishes to bring about, be it an opinion or a moral habit or a useful work, it is directed only toward the things that occur in the majority of cases and pays no attention to what happens rarely, or to the damage occurring to the unique human being because of this way of determination and because of the legal character of the governance. For the law is a divine thing, and it is your business to reflect on the natural things in which the general utility, which is included in them, nonetheless necessarily produces damages to individuals, as is clear from our discourse and the discourse of others." One more line. "In view of this consideration also, you will not wonder at the fact that the purpose of the law is not perfectly achieved in every individual, and that, on the contrary, it necessarily follows that there should exist individuals whom this governance of the law does not make perfect." The Rambam is saying And we don't have to agree with the Rambam. This is not the only position. But he's saying that the Torah was given for a people. And the Torah was not given to individuals. And I compare it in some ways to, you're driving down the street, let's say Road 38 near us, Talli, at night, and you get to a traffic light and it's 4 a.m. and there is no car coming from the other side. The only car there is a policeman, a police car looking out at you. The law is imperfect. There is no reason for you to stop at this red light and be late for whatever you're getting to at 4 a.m. I don't know why you're late for something at 4 a.m, but there's no reason to stop. But if you run that red light, the policeman will rightly give you a ticket because the law is not made for individuals. It's made for the group as a whole. And as a group, you can't run red lights, even if in this particular circumstance, it's really not relevant to you. It might even be bad for you. It might make you late for something. The flip side of that is that we have to have empathy and say, just because someone sees halacha as hurtful, that doesn't mean the person is wrong. That person can truly be suffering under the halachic system. That's not an indictment of halacha. The Rambam would say that's a natural and automatic consequence of having halacha that's not made for every personalized individual. It's about having something that's made for people. And in order to develop empathy and to include in our way of thinking, to have a little bit of, or to avoid that judgmentalism, to understand that how could you dare break halacha in this case? I'm not suggesting anyone do that, but understand what may work for you. The Rambam himself says it might not be working for that other person. He's not saying the person should break it, but at least have a little bit of sympathy and empathy. When that person doesn't see this as enriching that person's life, it damages that person's life. And we have no one less than the Rambam himself, Maimonides, to say, yes, that happens. So a little bit of empathy is in order, I think.
Did you have Rav Yoni because of what Rav Herschel Schachter?
No. It was actually from before that.
It was from before.
It was because of the Ben Shapiro article, which I had one article. I had one discussion. This was a follow-up discussion. The first one was saying why we thought that Ben Shapiro's article, in which he castigated the modern Orthodox world for its allowance of too much acceptance of LGBTQ. Right. So one person, Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sedensky, said why he thought Ben Shapiro was wrong. This was effectively a part 2. If in the first episode we talked about where we thought that Ben Shapiro was mistaken in his attitude, this was describing and prescribing how we should act towards members of the Orthodox community who identify as LGBTQ.
I'm looking forward. And I think that timing actually is great, given that particular occurrence. And I really look forward to listening. I think all rabbis can learn a lot from Rav Yoni. Okay,
well, Talli, thank you. This is very interesting, and I appreciate your insights, and I hope our listeners appreciate it as well. Please remember to go to intimatejudaism.com, subscribe to our podcast, share the podcast, go to jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com, and write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.